Hi, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. Thanks to all of you for joining us tonight and supporting Indie Live. This is our 147th show, just about. And thanks to you, Indie Live continues to flourish and grow, but it still needs your support. As I say many weeks, the BBC is operating on an enormous multi-million pound budget. Indie Live would settle for a mere fraction of that. So anything you can do to support and help the channel, and by the way, you'll be helping and supporting the TNT show. Well, it's been another great day for British democracy. Taxpayers now find that after spending £140 million on Rwanda and a further £1.6 billion on barges, it turns out that the UK now has no one in Rwanda and no one on a barge. As I said in the National, Sunday National, astonishingly, the Home Office Minister, Suella Braverman, is still in post. But then, as many people have pointed out to me, they say, John, you're being naive. And I say, in what way am I being naive? They say, look, mate, the reality is, if there weren't double standards at Westminster, Westminster wouldn't have any standards at all. And it looks like there might be some truth in that. Well, tonight we are talking to Stuart Donald. Stuart is a preeminent analyst, and he has looked at a range of issues which are going to be of enormous interest to you tonight. I mean, what you're going to hear tonight will fascinate you, because Stuart has taken the trouble that almost no one else has to look closely at why the UK is such an unequal country and why the state hasn't been able to deal with that inequality. In fact, in some areas, it seems to actually welcome inequality. And how the UK compares to other equivalent or appropriate states in the world. And that, again, will be a revelation. Anyway, without any further ado, let's talk to Stuart. Stuart, thanks for joining us. How are you?
Very well, thanks, John. Very well.
And how's life been treating you?
Not bad, not bad. Had a pretty good day today. A few spots of rain, but other than that, all good. No complaints.
And where are you joining us from?
So I'm in Linlithgow. I'm based in Linlithgow.
Oh,
work in Edinburgh. So yeah.
Oh, cool. Now, I mentioned inequality, but you see, inequality comes in all sorts of different shapes and sizes and forms. Tell us why inequality in the UK exercises you so much.
So, I mean, I got into doing the sort of the research work after Brexit, really. So Brexit really hit me hard, much more than I expected it would, simply because I didn't think that Brexit was going to happen. And I stumbled across Danny Darling, who I think you've had on your show as well, and then some data sets in the from the OECD, and they showed some staggering results that placed the UK as the real outcomes of inequality in Europe. And so this sort of drew me into just doing the research. Having coming from a sort of research analytics background, I was able to apply some of my experience, and I was just absolutely staggered to discover that on almost every measure, the UK is the standout of Europe. And then when you look at what you would consider the UK's most relevant peers, so the northwestern European countries, including Ireland and the Scandinavian countries, then it's even worse, right? And then when you get into that, you just see how different we are in a way that, again, the British establishment typically doesn't ever really admit, or whether it's conscious or not. Sometimes I think it's conscious, sometimes it isn't. And from there, I was just drawn further and further into it. But with that context of that particular peer group, the results are even more stark.
It will seem to a lot of people that states are accustomed to being unequal. It's very difficult to make everyone the same. There have been loads of efforts in the past that hasn't quite worked out. So What is it about the UK you think makes it so very difficult to address a problem like equality?
So I mean, the way that it works is that it comes down to the voting system, right? So this doesn't sound sort of intuitively obvious, but it is the mechanism of the voting system, I think, that is the core key driver for why we're so unequal compared to our European peers, and it's all because of the first past the post system. And again, often people recognize that and say, yeah, we know it's bad, first past the post, but it's considered to be a sort of a superficial nice to have. It's a bit clunky. We should move to PR. That would make things better and so on. But when you look at how the issues with first past the post link up, and then how that drives us to having a huge bias towards right-wing politics, then you can see that it's actually not premeditated. One of the most cathartic things that I've experienced in doing all this is to discover that this family of nations on this island, we're not culturally right-wing, according to the results that I've found. That there are more people left-leaning parties in modern recent elections in the UK than there are for right-leaning parties. Now that sounds intuitively wrong, but it's actually true when you look at the data over the last 11 elections since 1980. And so I don't know, it's satisfying to know that that we're just like every other European country in that sense, but our system organizes the way that politics works into a mechanism that drives and permits right-wing politics and continues to drive it to the right, to the extent that we're just not able to bring it back as a result of that.
You would think then that all the left-wing parties would say, well, since this is clearly the case, the way the first thing we should do, you would think, they would think, we ought to change the voting system. Because I've also said that the Conservative Party would not have attained power more than a couple of times in the last 2 or 3 decades had they been required to use a proportional system of some kind. So there must be some reason why the main left-wing party doesn't find any real difficulties with first past the post.
So that's right, and that's a probably thing in the whole sort of story, really, because when a lot of the work that I've done, you look at the Labour Party's performance when they were in power under Tony Blair, it shows that they were elected as the most powerful sort of so-called progressive party, right, in the war, since the war, with the biggest majority, 3 elections on the bounce, a generation in power. But when you look at how they performed in terms of government spending, welfare spending, health spending, and then statistics about quality of life to do with cancer survival, life expectancy, child mortality, they underperformed the median of that peer group that I spoke about every single year for the 13 years, right? They didn't get close in any instance, just looking at those metrics to closing the gap. We were overtaken by Ireland in terms of child mortality stats, health spending. Ireland that had come from the doldrums, as we know, right, until the late 80s, early 90s. And you sort of look at that and you think, well, how could that be? And unfortunate sort of cliche is that just power has a really powerful effect, right, on people, and so they were more interested in power, to put it bluntly, than they were in what we would consider to be their sort of progressive obligation as the left-leaning party of the UK. But that's the case in Canada and Australia and in New Zealand until they change the system, and the US. And it comes down to this thing that if you create 2 voter coalitions, so you've only got 2 parties in the first past the post system, that itself is a result of lost votes. People learn they have to vote for 1 or 2 parties if they want their vote to count. Then you create 2 coalitions of voters, the haves and the have-nots, and again, the statistic that I didn't know was that the coalition of the haves, the people that vote for the Conservatives in the UK, is a much bigger group, right? Because when the OECD data defines it as people that are earning more than the medium income level in the UK and all other Western countries is about 70% of the electorate. Okay, so obviously not all of them vote for the Tories, but it's such a big group that as long most of the ordinary people that are not interested in politics, but they know they've got a holiday to pay for, a big mortgage, and so on. They're not really interested in anything else other than what's best for me. They've got something to lose. They don't want any more tax to pay. They vote for the party that's going to do that, and that's it. That's basically what we've created. That's why we appear to be so less progressively minded as a society than our peers in Europe.
So you reckon people have become educated to accept the very small differences between these two groups as being large. In other words, there is no attachment perhaps to major reform because the two parties would find that unwholesome unless the major reform was on the right. And then it can be espoused. If it's on the left, then it becomes very difficult for people to do that, perhaps, because they're concerned about donations, sponsorship. They're concerned about media reaction. I can see there's a raft of issues out there which militate against radical thinking. Never mind radical proposals.
Exactly. And that's it, and the challenge then is, for the Labour Party to break out of that. So part of your question before, well, why do they not then? And it's because, and I suppose all political parties will have this element, right? Of just tribalism, and so they I mean, there's 3 or 4 things that prevent them from doing this. So firstly, the history of the Labour Party, great big old church. There's lots of people in the Labour Party that don't want to see the Labour Party die, and I think people expect that, maybe not immediately, but at some time, after a move to PR, you don't need these great big massive parties. They're going to break up and they'll splinter. That hasn't happened yet in New Zealand, but it's expected. And then, I mean, the real problem, if you want, and this is very interesting because I've been talking to a lot of the guys in groups like Compass recently about this work. They're interested in it. The Parliamentary Labour Party. So, as most people will know, the party itself, at its last conference, voted for the first time to institute PR into its constitution. So that's a massive change, right? That's a big deal. But the Parliamentary Party is always the barrier. So they reckon there's about 100 of the 200 Labour MPs in power who know they're in seats that would be vulnerable if they move to PR, comfortable seats. They're probably good, solid individuals doing a good constituency job, but like their careers, and so they're not going to vote comfortably for PR, even if you could convince them that from a progressive perspective it's the way forward. If you could show them this sort of stuff, and there are other things to do with tribalism, and not least Stammer wants a go at the big job like Blair and Brown were able to do. And both of them had the opportunity to do something about PR. Blair had it in his manifesto in '97, but his majority was so huge, he walked away from it. I think Gordon Brown in a parallel universe could have done a different job in 2010 with the Libs, but they didn't really try, and it's just, unfortunately, it suits these two parties to continue their game. And another thing is that the Labour Party is the guaranteed party of opposition. As soon as you bring PR in, that goes, so there are conflicts that don't sound too moral, but they're there and they're at play.
We've had a question. Would PR in England lead to more right-wing parties in Westminster and possibly Lib Dems being in coalition with either Labour or Conservatives? I think you've probably answered that.
I just think that, when you look at how people vote, it shouldn't work out like that. And I remember as well the other thing about PR, which we're not covering right now, but is this thing that we get in the press about, oh, look at all these right wing parties that appear on the continent. And often our press is just not being honest and saying, you know what, Giorgia Meloni's Fratelli, they're just as right wing, no less or no more right wing than our Tories to a great extent, or Vox in Spain. But what always happens in PR is, even if they get to power, which isn't that often, admittedly, Maloney's people are more power than anybody's ever had with that sort of agenda, but they're still tied to the PR, which means they have to compromise, which means they have to go into coalition, which means they can't prosecute the manifesto in the way that they would like. And you could look back and say ourselves, well, how did the Tories deal with UKIP and with party? Well, they looking at it purely from an efficiency perspective, very effectively, but they just moved to cover the ground, so they've effectively absorbed it into their their prospectus. So I think PR it won't happen overnight. I mean, there is a cultural question, right? I mean, I this discussion with my wife about this regularly. So if you could change the US, the UK, Australia, and Canada overnight to PR, would they immediately become like Germany or the Netherlands or Sweden? And I would expect, of course, not. But eventually, simply because the mechanism gives opportunities to smaller, more focused parties like Greens or smaller issue parties, then it's difficult to see how it wouldn't come about. That's why everybody's looking at New Zealand just now to see how quickly it happens there, and it's slow there.
It's interesting you say that, because you spoke briefly about Vox, and the situation in Spain is that they still don't have a government yet. I think the King has actually plumped for the group, the Conservatives, who had most seats. But they would have to combine with Vox, the further right party, in order to secure government. And even then, it wouldn't give them enough seats. So the socialists are thinking about cutting deals with the separatists in Catalonia and the Basque Country in order to secure a majority. And it looks like, I don't know, the outcome might be that way. And of course, when I speak to people in the UK, they say, well, that just demonstrates the point. You don't have stable government anymore when you have all these different groups. Thinking, well, what are the reputed advantages of stable government that we're benefiting from just now?
Right. I mean, exactly, right. And this is the thing, and I grew up in the Thatcherite era, and I went to Strathclyde University, and surrounded by Fraser Allender, thinking at the time, and it was just an accepted orthodoxy that the Thatcherite agenda was probably the least daft, least bad thing we could do, and there was no evidence to suggest that not spending money in the state and keeping the state small, and inside the voting system, which is all about efficiency, unlike the European countries, they're months negotiating and so on, you get things done and so on. You can't argue with that. But then when you get this data that shows that 9 of the 10 poorest regions in Northwest Europe are in the UK, and the wealthiest of the top 10 is also in the UK, which means the whole of wealthy Northwest Europe is between this barbell, it's the UK. You can say, like, how can anybody if you're going to be honest about just what the data says, how can anybody say that this is successful? So what if we're efficient, right? What's the purpose of efficiency if our standards, our quality of life, and now our GDP are all inferior to this other model, where they've applied a more moderated version of this, of the neoliberal ideas that we've all been living with for the last 40 years, So, that's so tired, an answer nowadays, given that context,
It is. I sometimes wonder too if we maybe got the reaction to, because people know there's inequality. I mean, they see it every day. They walk down the street and some guy or woman or child, worse than that, is begging. The whole country is encrusted in food banks. So it's not as if people aren't aware of inequality. They just don't see, I suspect, the political process as any way of addressing that.
Mhm.
because the political process is saying it's not important for me to address this. What's
Yeah.
important for me is to be in power. And I want to be able to hold the purse strings and decide what other people do. And I think one of the disabling principles that underpins all of this is the notion that, that things are done to people.
Mhm.
People don't do things. I think at least that mentality, I think particularly in Scotland, I have to say,
Mhm.
when I discern more of it, traveling around other countries, I don't get the same sense of people feeling that they are mere victims in the political process.
Mhm.
When they want to kick the politicians know they've been kicked
Yeah.
and they change.
Yeah.
They say,
No, that's right.
I can't just sit here and ignore
Mhm.
people who just told me categorically that they don't like me and my policies. So I have
Yeah.
to change. It
Mhm.
doesn't seem to me there's any incentive in the UK, particularly for politicians to acquire that sensitivity
Yeah.
outside of the political, that small political circle, as it were.
Yeah. That's right. And there's a lot linked to that. You see the stats on the first past the post countries in terms of like voter engagement is much lower, in the sort of the lower income, the poorer areas of the electorate. I mean, there's a link here as well, I suppose, to some of the issues with just how accessible politics is, and how centralised we are and how weak or thin our sort of like local government and engagement sort of is. There's a lot there. But I haven't gone into to that bit. But one of the other things I suppose that maybe linked to what you're saying there, John, is when you look at just your example there of Spain, right? So the cooperation there is between parties that otherwise could look like very uncomfortable bedfellows. When you think about the ultimate, the GroKo stuff that the Germans and the Austrians talk about, where you've got the dominant Socialist Party and the dominant centre right Christian Democrat Party, finding a way of working together. I mean, you look at the Netherlands, so they've been one of the most, if you want, right-leaning in terms of the governments they voted for of the continental peers. But I think something I can't remember exactly, but something like 13 out of the 17 last governments they've had have involved coalitions that cross the left-right divide. I mean, it's just like unheard of in the UK. But it's not even something that we consider or expect, because you imagine that the trouble would be caused if you had that sort of thing. And then our experiences of coalitions are so disastrous, that people think that, well, that's what they must be like in the continent. Like, of course, it's not the case, but this is, I think, the thing that I find the most like emotionally disturbing is just how complicit the British establishment is in playing back to us that there's something normal about this, that allowing the Labour Party to spend so many hours, just before we get tired of the Tories and question time, and a Labour MP just had to turn up and say something bad about the Tories, and people cheer and clap, and they sound like they're representing the people, but they never do, because they never get to power, and when they do, they have to go so far to that. You know what I mean? If you were able to bring some light from just what happens across the North Sea or even Ireland to that context and help people understand that, you would expect there would be a much bigger reaction. Like, I thought, the motivation for my work has been to say, can we find a way, at least in Scotland, trying to bring that to bear,
Yeah, I mean, you make a very interesting point, it seems to me. I mean, anyone who comes into contact with other countries can't help but feel, when they look at the UK, that a number of the straightforward discussions that take place elsewhere don't take place in the UK.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What fills that space, which should be there, is nostalgia. There's this extraordinary and deep-rooted nostalgia. I mean, I saw a snatch of a news program aimed at the Midlands a couple of weeks ago, and they were celebrating Bomber Command. And I'm thinking, how many people in Italy, in Spain, in Germany, in France have this extraordinary attachment to not it's not as if they were not celebrating the brave who died. That would be entirely laudable. it was a clear and distinct way of saying this is a symbol of what we were once.
Mhm.
We need to get back there. We have allowed ourselves somehow to be diverted
Mhm.
away from our rightful role as world leaders.
Yeah.
And I know when I point out in columns and elsewhere that India is about to overtake China as the most populous state, it's like, what's this got to do with anything? We
Yeah.
should be talking about Bomber Command and Spitfire. And I think, hold on a second, how many people under 40 have the slightest understanding of what a Spitfire is?
Mhm.
I mean, it not only seems overly nostalgic, it seems to be grossly self-indulgent. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like watching somebody who's got no rear end in their trousers prancing about, to some ancient tune. I mean, it just seems
Mhm.
weird.
I know. I mean, and and the guy we spoke about, Darling, when he writes about this and its influence, and I think he's talking about it particularly from the way it influences people that end up in positions of power in the UK. But again, that's another. I think again, I use this word like therapeutic thing that I found, because it's how absurd this is. Why we like this, and there are, and there are, historical differences. I know that everyone knows that between the UK and the continent, not least because of how the war worked out and so on. But what I discovered with this work was, and it was Danny Darling that led me into it, is then the link between inequality and Brexit itself, right? And so there's a hugely powerful argument to 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 say, look, inequality is actually probably the most important ingredient over and above the stuff that we all see, the money that the powerful groups spent, Farage, the momentum that whipped up and so on. Actually, none of that would have mattered had there not been enough energy, right, to go towards the idea of voting for Brexit. And when you look at, the areas of the UK, obviously mostly in England, that voted for Brexit, and you look at the areas that have suffered the biggest impact, right? And again, this is ONS data on this deprivation study they do every 4 or 5 years. Then the correlation is striking, right? But the output is unexpected in that it's areas that have been the bedrock of the Middle England Tory vote, right? So not the wealthiest, but wealthy enough, middle class, Middle England, that voted for Brexit. And when you look at what this data tells you, that the fall off in quality of life, the reduction in quality of life experienced in things like housing and education and other factors in these areas, and then you map where the real heat points were, where the vote leave was at its most concentrated, and it's in these Tory constituencies. And the most tragic thing of all that is that they've been Tory constituencies forever. I'm talking about areas that voted Tory all the way through the Blair years as well. Then Brexit happens, Brexit gets delivered as a result of that, and then they vote Tory again and again. So like this is just the what I've started describing in the blogs I've been writing is it feels like it's the road to hell, because how do you get out of that? We just sleepwalking into an ever more unequal experience, and then what's next is another Brexit, but it's not going to look like Brexit, but it'll be another trauma like that, where
Yeah.
the society will react and push back, kick back, which is effectively what happened there.
We've had a whole range of questions tonight, and thank you, everyone. I can't take all of them, and some of them actually are associated with an area which I'm not sure that Stuart has enough time to deal with, in terms of whether the Scottish Labour Party is right to call itself the Scottish Labour Party if it's funded from elsewhere. Unless you tell me right now you really want to get into that, we'll move on.
I think I agree with the direction of the
Okay.
of
In
the
that
question.
case, let me take two other questions, which I'm going to suggest that they're linked, but you may decide that they're not, and feel free. Charles Smith is saying, are we in danger, because it follows on from your last remarks, are we in danger of following American the American system where Republicans are jettisoning reason in favour of winning at all costs.
Well, I
And
think
the other question, which I think is associated, but again, feel free to separate these. Chris Terrell is saying, how much are these structural problems also reinforced by allowing elected politicians an uninterrupted career in politics with no constraints on time served?
Yeah, I think I can see that the link there. I mean, I think we are in that space. It's not as crass. It doesn't appear to be as crass or as visible to us as some of that indulgence from the Republicans. But I mean, I would just go back to the discussions I know that are happening with what we would consider to be the sort of normal left think tanks in England. And their discussions with the Labour Party about moving to PR. I mean, there is no justification. There is no justification for first past the post now. There is none, right? I mean, I'm not suggesting that the work I've done should be, immediately emerge and change the course of the truth, right? But I mean, effectively, even without that, there is no justification for it. So, we're already in a place where that's happening, I think, and then the other things about timing, I don't know how exactly it works, setting limits on how long people can stay in power, but there was bound to be things we can learn from the PR model. I mean, the German PR model, which is the one that ours is based on, is probably the least PR, right, of the others that I've seen, just in terms of how it performs. Like, so I think Kohl in the 80s almost managed to secure a majority, like Salmon did with the SNP here, and I think the New Zealand Labour Party did it recently as well. But it's still much more successful in terms of, for example, spending government money. Right? Germany spends €1 billion a week more on health than we do in the UK, and they've been doing that for the last decade. But their chancellors can go on forever, it would appear. So I don't know if that is necessarily a discrete problem in of itself. It certainly is one where ultimately the system is rotten, right? Which is what I'm saying, and you've only got two parties. But another thing I got asked on Sunday at a talk was, is our PR system the right one for Scotland in the long term? And of course, that we have to decide that ourselves, but I think it probably is it's a good one to start with, because of its design mapping to something that's closer to first past the post in its character. But anyway, sorry.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think the question in particular was about careerist politicians, i.e. that the two-party system maybe provides extra inducements for people who have no other life experiences to become career politicians. And the question is, how healthy is that, or unhealthy?
Well, I mean, yeah, I don't know how different it is. I don't know how easy it is to become a career politician in these other in the PR countries, to be honest. So I don't really know to say that, but I think anyway, I would certainly say that you would rather people had experience outside of politics if they're going to end up in politics for a long time, right? I mean, I think yeah.
I mean, it is interesting that. I mean, I suspect the UK is in deeper trouble than most people would understand or acknowledge. There are indicators, financial, economic, social, that would suggest that. Is that your view, or do you feel that the version of the health of the nation is accurately described in the media and elsewhere?
You mean the health of the nation in terms of?
In terms of the totality of the health of the nation. In other words, if somebody was delivering, as they do in the States, the president says, here's the state of the nation.
No, Yeah, and I don't believe we do. I mean, I wonder how conscious it is, or how deliberate it is, But I suspect it is known that just how far behind we are, our neighbours in so many ways. Um, um, but again, we're an island. I wonder how honest the Germans are and the French are. The bigger countries where you can lose yourself within your state. But I mean, when one of the things that I suppose that I come back to the work that I've done that again is a particular irritation is when you see how the establishment, but also the Tories, they how casually they present themselves as like a centre right party, and people talk about the centre right, and people write about the centre right. The IFS do it as well, and that to me is starting to become, really disingenuous, because it's just not true. Our politics, and the extent to which the neoliberal set of ideas, the small state, has been so much more stridently applied, by the Tories, and then supported in sort of a caretaker role by the Labour Party, is not made clear to us, and I don't see why it would be, though. If the only people that know what's going on are our leaders, the people that are in power, then then that wouldn't be a big surprise. It goes back to, I suppose maybe most people have heard this, and I didn't used to have the same sort of impact on me now. But I mean, something that Margaret Thatcher said when she was asked about her great success, apparently, and she said two words. She said their great success, in terms of legacy, was Tony Blair. And it made me think, actually, more time goes on, and the more you look at the stuff, they really do understand how the system and how beneficial it is for the party. And if you allow a system to become as inefficient or as dysfunctional as ours, then I'm afraid this is what happens. Human nature, is motivated by its own, the goals of the cult, the goals of the party, that in our case are just not aligned to our needs.
Do you think that the UK is very much on a trajectory of decline?
Well, yeah. I mean, we don't invest. We don't have a culture of investing. We've got, you can just look at things like football and the Premier League, and how that affects the way we handle our football as well. I mean, you remember, John, and most people of our age group will remember, like, you come through the decades of the sneering towards, how much money is spent on infrastructure and sort of planning in countries like Germany and France, and then they emerge now, with world-class transport networks. I mean, I saw another stat from the FT. I think we have the lowest percentage of trams and metros, for any country, even the US, who where they hate the public transport, for big cities over 2 million people. It was in the FT just last week. I mean, it's just another example. You saw the stuff from the King's Fund's report on the health service recently, and how much slower our health service has been in recovering the rhythm of routine operations like knee replacements, hip replacements, cataracts, and so on. I mean, much slower in terms of pickup, compared to our continental peers. And then their answer, and they're trying to be as apolitical as possible, this group, is like, it's just chronic, historic underinvestment. It's a legacy of underinvestment, and this is 40 years of this, of allowing marketism, small statism, and therefore the consequences of that, to build on itself. And this, COVID was another example. Why is it we and our first past the post countries, or not all of them, but certainly the US, it coped so badly? Well, we've got rid of the state. No one knows how to organise state projects. No one has any experience to to face what happens in a crisis. We've got rid of all that. We give that to Ernst & Young now, because we built our structure a liberal economy. Effectively that's it. So yeah, this is why I worry. That it sounds like you're going to be super sensationalist and say, well, how do you get out of this? Right? It's going to have to be the people that revolt, or the people that do something about it. you need a disruption, right? If we can't rely on the Tories and the Labour Party to break out of it, then what is it? Which is why obviously independence for us is the obvious route.
Yeah, and it seems to me I've got friends across a whole range of countries, and when they look at the UK, I ask them, so what are the characteristics that you find laudable? And nobody ever mentions the economy. They never, it's like, I don't know, but it's like tourism, and there's nothing wrong with tourism, frankly, provided it's managed. But it tends to be restricted to that. There isn't much else that people find commendable. It's just that it's not even a handful of things anymore. Because I think Brexit has done for the oldest electoral system or the oldest parliament in the world. I'm not sure that's true, by the way, but that was a projection that was made at one time. I think some of the Norse countries had a parliament long before there was one in London. But leaving that aside, the reality is that there isn't much that people find terribly commendable about the UK. And I think when people start to sell it, they tend to sell it on nostalgia. It's like it's like watching a hamster on a wheel. Nobody's actually the hamster doesn't actually go anywhere, but there's lots of energy. So it might think it's going somewhere, but it isn't. It's on the same path. And I hear politicians saying the same things they said 20 years ago. And I think if I was a young person, I'd find that desperate, frankly.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure where the wallowing in nostalgia gets you, except it allows you to avoid dealing with reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's it. It really is. When you see though how ordinary or how it appears to be to live with these conflicts that prevent us from doing anything about changing it, then it's even more terrifying because New Zealand is the only place that's managed to make the change. I mean, they had a classic British imperial first past the post system, and it took them 20 years to get out of it. And they had a lot of luck, and there were a lot of political things that happened that were mistakes or weird, so a conservative politician keeping his word that there would be a referendum on electoral reform, which he didn't need to do. He could have walked away from it and probably escaped. And a number of other things that that happened. There were just sort of unusual pieces of luck that came together. Yeah. But that's the only time, really that there has been a change made, to an electoral system where it wasn't for some other opportunistic game. Even PR on the continent only happened because the emerging industrialized middle classes were worried about the emergence of socialism. They managed to organize, the political class to institute PR, thinking that PR would prevent there ever being a domination by socialism. So that in itself, then emerges today as being, I'm putting forward as being the optimal solution, actually was born out of something that was never imagined. I would say the same for our PR arrangement in Scotland, that, with the best will in the world, and no disrespect to all the great work done by the Constitutional Convention and people that were involved in it, but the real thing that mattered was the Labour Party, right? It was either them or the Tories, whoever was going to be in power in our first past the post environment needed to back it. And we know that, certainly their main interest there, alongside the Parliament, was to try and manage the emergence of the idea of Scotland. So now, what I think is even more fascinating is if there's any truth in the stuff that I've sort of unearthed here, is that might transpire to be maybe the ultimate mistake by unionism, by giving Scotland this platform that's like 25 years old, would it be? And we're now mature and we're now emerging into it. It takes a long time to get used to new political systems. You bring independence to the fore and we move on with that, we're already in a great place. We don't have to go through all the stuff that how long it's going to take for the rest of the UK to ever deal with,
Yeah, and you can see a whole range of outcomes there. I, I'd be interested in your thoughts on you know there is a notion here. People uh, who look down the pike, as the Americans say, if you were to say, okay, what's going to happen in the UK in electoral terms in the next 3 or 4 years, 5 years, the likelihood is that Labour is going to become the government at the next election. It's difficult to see how the Tories can make up all the ground that they've lost currently, particularly against the Labour Party, which has put PR, not the PR we've been discussing, but public relations front and centre. They've decided that they will offer nothing, they will decide nothing, they will commit nothing except platitudes. And the notion being that you don't want to upset the horses, so you get yourself elected. That's when the trouble really begins, because the likelihood is that after an enormous public relations campaign prior to the election, that will probably have the effect of reducing their majority from the status it is just now, maybe to maybe 10 or 20. And that would leave them vulnerable to some sort of deal with the SNP and others. Even assuming that the polls are still the way they are in a year's time, let's say, and I don't think they will be, because I think there are a number of crises to come that we haven't quite understood the nature and the depth of them. But let's assume that they do get in, they get in with about 10, maybe 20 seat majority. The Labour Party is notorious for squabbling. Unlike the Tories, who have a goal which is personal advancement, personal enrichment, there is nothing there that necessarily holds the Labour Party together in quite such a dramatic and concrete way. So the likelihood is that they will start to fall apart, and there'll be defections, and there'll be the usual stuff that goes on at Westminster, and they'll have to spend money. And for some reason, by repeating this mantra over and over again, there is no money. We can't make commitments. They effectively box themselves in, because the first time they make a commitment, bingo, you're into a very different environment. Oh, look, there's the Labour Party spending more than it's earned. Classic.
Yeah.
And that means that the by-elections will not go well, and they'll be out of office in 4 years' time, let's say.
Yeah.
And the Tories will be back.
That's right.
Because that's the way first past the post works.
Yeah, and even if they get, this is this casual assumption that, because it's been so long, they'll get maybe another term or 3 terms, then, again, the evidence suggests that, well, what else are you going to do? I mean, one of the things I find really interesting, even amongst these great people I've been dealing with, with the stuff, the think tanks that are interested in trying to bring about this stuff in England, they're trapped by this belief that they point back to the Labour Party of the late 90s, going, well, they had loads of money and they had a booming economy, and there was was much more thinking and just a much better set of circumstances for them to go on and do great things. Well, no, they didn't. I mean, there's this waiting list thing that gets talked about, and then there's the greatest peacetime increase in public spending. That half of that was for the Iraq War, and we never got close to our peers in Europe. So what on earth do we think Stammer's going to do, to your point, where he's now already telling us he can't spend any more money, he's not going to take on these super right-wing social policies, the rape clause and the likes and so on. It's even with 15 years, the care you think that they would have to take in order to ensure they don't upset the establishment parts of the press that will just jump on that and say, look, profligate, danger, can't put them back into power, and this is it, and back to what you were saying earlier, this is where there are voices within the Labour Party that would say, well, this doesn't work, does it? We've got to get out,
And it just seems to me that it's the wrong way to do it. It's like I'm going to treat the electorate as idiots because I've worked it all out, and one of the things I've worked out is they're not to be trusted. So I'll feed them any old nonsense in order to get in, and once I'm in, then I can then start to change things. But I'm not going to commit to any change. So therefore, what happens? What is your manifesto? In other words, what authority, moral authority, do you have to change anything? If you already said in advance you don't plan to change anything. So in other words, it will be surrounded by caveats. And the trouble with the caveats is that they'll be torn apart at the election. Because the opposition, i.e. the Tories, will say things like, oh, look at this rider at the bottom of page 5 of this report. It says that if money does become available, we're going to spend it like drunken sailors. Now, that's not what the report says, but that's what it will be. That's how it will be presented. I'll give you a typical example. Everyone knows, I suspect, or if they don't know it as intimately and as detailed as you know it, that radical change isn't essential. But when the Tories are confronted with a notion that says this is the sort of change we need, independence, a federal structure, they say, look at the cost of it. We should be spending the money on the NHS. We should
I know.
We should be spending the money on education. And of course, people will say, well, you don't.
I know.
You're in power right now, and you don't. You would rather give it to Lady Moan on specious grounds than give it to some kid who needs education.
Yeah.
What are you assisting with university fees in England and Wales? Simple question.
I know. I mean, that's another thing. I'm in the process of trying to work out how to cover this. But that another thing that we get, this thing about the allocation from the Barnett formula, and everybody in the British part or the Scottish part of the British establishment seems to want to consume this and play it back as, well, look at this, it's pretty good, isn't it? We get more per head population than the rest of the UK. That's how, as far as the analysis goes. But if you just take health, right? I mean, I think we spend certainly over the last 5 or 6 years something like 12 or 13 billion from the Barnett formula on health. So it's about a third of the 40 billion that comes to the Scottish government. If that Barnett formula was set by any other government in the peer group, right, the sensible peer group, an average of them, right, then we would be talking about having £5 billion a year more to spend on health just as a consequence of that, right? I mean, no one ever goes near that. Like you say, that there's this immediate tack to challenge the aspirations of the independence idea by bringing it back to daily tactics, but no one ever surfaces that to say, I mean, what does it mean if you spend $1 billion a week more on the health service for every week for the last 10 years, right? And how can you conceivably then expect that we can achieve the same standards and quality of life, life expectancy, child, survival, all these things, if we starve ourselves of that? It's quite a difficult argument though to make, though, because we've spent so long and so many decades listening to this thing that now feels like embedded in truth. This, along the lines of spending government money as profligate, you have to be much more parsimonious, you have to be thrifty. Now, and having lived with that and accepted that for most of my life, you think that's turned on its head, because you're saying, well, people want to live healthy lives and live a long life and so on. And so if it means more money, then that's what it means. You're going to tell us the Germans and the Dutch and the Swedes are all super inefficient. Well, even if they are, the quality of life in these countries is in every sense better. So, can we not learn from that? Do we not go there,
Yeah. I mean, there's a general question that Charles is asking, and he says, what is your view on the veracity of the media when it comes to reporting statistics and statistical information in general? I mean, if you were to mark them out of 10, what mark would you give them?
Well, I think that, and this is probably the thing that drawn me in to do the work is the thing that I think is most important is everything I've written is this peer group, and if the media did that, even 10% of the time, it would just inject a different perspective into how we look at things. We never. So, for example, the thing that I think is most disgraceful, right, in the media is that you only ever compare the performance of the Labour Party against the Tories, right, that are the most strident, the most powerful, the most right wing, party, in our space, in our continent. How on earth could that be a sensible benchmark to judge the Labour Party's performance, right? That sort of thing. But again, it feels like it's a big country problem, It's not. I don't think it's deliberate or an insidious thing, But I mean, it's certainly something I've thought about in terms of how to communicate and engage people about this sort of work. So, well, why don't we? OECD data is all there. It's free. It's super easy to consume, and it's all consistently vetted. It's the most impartial, objective data set you can get for this sort of stuff.
I'll give you an answer. It may sound oblique, if not whimsical, but Boris Johnson, when he was the Telegraph's correspondent in Brussels, had access to reams of information from the EU about what it was doing, why it was doing it, all the rest of that good stuff. And he chose to publicise a problem about bananas.
Yeah.
He said they want to move towards straight bananas, I believe. And that's not because he didn't understand. He understood. The data was there. Intelligent people had bent over backwards to provide him with the data and to make it accessible. Despite that, he went ahead and talked about bananas. That was politically motivated. And I think what's behind the question from Charles perhaps is, how much of what we're seeing in terms of statistical ineptitude is actually deliberate, i.e. it's not just the paucity of information that journalists generally suffer from.
Yeah, it must be. I mean, the more the more you learn, having lived through the Brexit experience, then just how we seem to have even absorbed that into the landscape of BAU UK. There's no way this is innocent, right? There's denial there. So yeah, I mean it's just another worrying part of the.
We don't have much time, but it does seem to me that when you talk about setting up a rapid rebuttal system, that's the problem you run into, which is that there is no motivation for journalists to be accurate. There is no motivation for journalists not to be sensational. In fact, the motivations are all the other way, because it's much easier not to do any thinking, and it's much easier just to grab a headline from nowhere and hope that the person will not read the script underneath. And that's what seems to be the case increasingly. Of course, I would accept the National and the Sunday National from these comments, but nonetheless, if you look at the great mass of the UK media, it tends to conform to that in large part.
That's right. It's almost like they somehow get sucked into the establishment position that it suits careers and it suits journalism as well, to just go with the flow and write about bits and pieces, but within the context of where we are. But I still think that it's a difficult thing it's difficult to find data that allows you to sort of look outside and get a sense, So yeah, I mean, it would be fantastic if we could do something about that. Before
we close, tell people how they can get in touch with you. You have a blog, you have a website. Tell us how to get in touch with you.
Yeah, so I've got a website. I think it was on the link there. It's sdonaldforpr.com, and all my materials there. That's it there. Great.
Good.
But yeah, fantastic.
Well, there it is on the screen now. Well, everyone, that's how to access all the great information that Stuart is producing. And it will be to everyone's benefit if you can go there, take a look at it, and spread the news that there are some accurate statistics around if you care to look for them. And look to Stuart first and foremost when you're looking for accurate statistics. Stuart, thanks very much. It's been enlightening, educational, and entertaining. Very much appreciate it. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Yeah, likewise.
A few concluding remarks. Thanks again.
Right,
Well,
no, thank you.
Big thank you to Stuart for joining us tonight, and a big thank you to all of you for watching. And as you saw on the screen, I have a column coming out on Sunday National this weekend. I haven't quite decided what to do, but in the light of some of the things that Stuart has told me tonight, with your permission, I might talk about one or two of these things, Stuart.
Yeah, great. Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you very much, John. Delighted to be invited on. Great.
Take care. Look after yourself.
Thank you.
Good night,
Thanks
everyone.
very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.